Kindness. The greatest wealth of all. Have you ever wondered how the tiniest act of kindness can transform your world? The smallest seed in a garden can produce the largest harvest. Like Marcy from our church, whose simple hospital visit sparked a community outreach program, the most significant transformations often begin with seemingly insignificant acts. Christian communities throughout history have recognized that material generosity without kindness of spirit falls short of God's design. True wealth isn't measured by possessions but by our relationships. As we examine the garden metaphor Jesus employed, we discover how patience and consistent care yields a harvest far exceeding what we initially planted, revealing kindness as the truest measure in God's economy. Winter's barren field. Understanding spiritual isolation. Have you ever observed a barren winter field? The stark landscape, devoid of growth and seemingly lifeless, stands as a powerful metaphor for what happens in the absence of kindness. Before we can truly understand the transformative power of generosity, we must first acknowledge this winter season of spiritual isolation that many communities and individuals experience. In our modern world, an intriguing paradox unfolds. Material abundance surrounds us, yet spiritual scarcity pervades our communities. This disconnect emerges largely from our attachment to possessions rather than people. When we elevate the acquisition of things above the cultivation of relationships, we create a spiritual barrenness that no material wealth can remedy. Our homes may be filled with objects, but our hearts remain empty of the connections that give life true meaning. The spiritual winter spreads across society as we increasingly prioritize accumulation over connection. Our neighborhoods reflect this reality. Homes become fortresses rather than havens of hospitality, and common spaces where genuine connection might flourish are abandoned or privatized. We construct invisible barriers that isolate us from one another, reinforcing the barren landscape of our communities. The scriptures offer a compelling portrait of this paradox in Matthew 19 verses 16 to 22. The rich young ruler, a man who seemingly had everything, wealth, status, and religious devotion, went away sorrowful when Jesus invited him to sell his possessions and follow. His attachment to material wealth prevented him from embracing true spiritual abundance. His possessions, rather than providing freedom, had become his prison. By contrast, consider those who had little materially yet demonstrated remarkable spiritual wealth. The widow who gave her last 2 coins in the temple treasury, Mark 12 verses 41 to 44, exhibited a generosity that transcended her circumstances. The early Christian communities described in Acts 4 verses 32 to 35, who held their possessions in common and ensured that there was not a needy person among them, cultivated a spiritual abundance that defied their modest means. Their detachment from possessions created space for attachment to one another. Our emphasis on accumulation produces diminished well-being and reduced social connection. When material acquisition becomes our primary pursuit, we inadvertently trade the warmth of human connection for the cold comfort of ownership. The pursuit of possessions cultivates a mindset of scarcity rather than abundance. We begin to view others as competitors for limited resources rather than companions in a shared journey. The maintenance of our possessions consumes time and energy that might otherwise be invested in relationships. Material attachment obscures our vision of what truly matters, the divine image reflected in every person we encounter. We become spiritually impoverished even as we accumulate wealth, creating a profound hunger that material goods cannot satisfy. Like seeds dormant beneath winter snow, our capacity for connection lies waiting for the conditions that will allow it to flourish. The recognition of our spiritual poverty, our need for something beyond what possessions can provide, becomes the first breaking of the frozen ground. Acknowledging our isolation prepares the soil where authentic generosity might take root. Spring's first seedlings, the transformative power of small kindnesses. As the frozen ground of isolation begins to thaw, what emerges first in the landscape of community transformation? The biblical parable of the mustard seed offers a profound revelation. The most significant changes often begin with actions so small they appear insignificant to the casual observer. This principle, illustrated in Matthew 13 verses 31 to 32, exemplifies how the smallest of seeds can grow into something remarkable. A metaphor perfectly applied to the nascent stages of kindness within communities previously characterized by isolation. Our contemporary understanding of generosity often suffers from a fundamental misconception that meaningful impact requires grand gestures or substantial financial contributions. We celebrate million-dollar donations to charitable foundations while overlooking the transformative potential of a kind word to a discouraged colleague or spending 5 minutes in genuine conversation with someone experiencing loneliness. This misapprehension stems partly from our culture's quantification of value. We believe larger contributions necessarily yield greater impact, when spiritual economics operates by entirely different principles. Consider the neurological evidence supporting the transformative nature of small kindnesses. When we engage in acts of generosity, regardless of their scale, our brains release dopamine, activating reward pathways that produce genuine happiness and satisfaction. Have you ever noticed how a simple compliment can alter your entire emotional state? This neurological response occurs in both the giver and recipient, creating a shared experience of well-being that transcends the apparent significance of the act itself. These neural connections, strengthened through repeated kind interactions, literally rewire our brains toward pro-social behavior, establishing pathways that make generosity increasingly natural over time. The Macedonian Church, as described in 2 Corinthians 8 verses 2 to 5, demonstrates this principle historically. Despite experiencing extreme poverty, this community gave beyond their ability out of their joy, resulting in what Paul describes as a wealth of generosity. Their contribution, though financially modest, transcended material value because it emerged from authentic love rather than obligation. This biblical example illuminates how genuine compassion, rather than quantity, determines impact. In the early fabric of community formation, initial expressions of kindness function as the first tender shoots breaking through previously hardened ground. Consider Dorcas, Acts 9 verses 36 to 42, known simply for making clothes for those in need. This seemingly ordinary skill, offered consistently with compassion, so profoundly impacted her community that after her death, widows gathered to show Peter the garment she had made, testifying to how her modest contributions had clothed both their bodies and spirits. Dorcas exemplifies how consistent care creates environments where deeper connections flourish. Words themselves represent perhaps the smallest seeds of all, yet possess remarkable generative potential. A timely word of encouragement functions as water and sunlight to newly emerging relationships, nourishing connections that might otherwise wither in their vulnerability. These verbal expressions of kindness cost nothing materially but create spaces where trust can develop and authentic relationships can form. The transformation from isolated individuals to connected community emerges through consistent small acts that establish new patterns of relating. When someone regularly checks on an elderly neighbor, shares produce from their garden, or remembers another's name and story, these seemingly minor gestures accumulate into a foundation of trust that eventually supports more substantial forms of mutual care and collective action. What makes these small beginnings so powerful is their accessibility. While not everyone possesses substantial financial resources or exceptional talents, everyone can offer presence, attention, and simple acts of consideration. This universal capacity for small kindnesses democratizes the work of community formation, allowing every person to participate meaningfully in cultivating collective well-being. The mustard seed principle reveals that transformation doesn't depend on extraordinary resources but on ordinary generosity consistently applied. Summer's abundant growth. Cultivating connections through sustained generosity. From the accessibility of small beginnings emerges a more profound question. What neurological and spiritual changes occur when casual acts of kindness evolve into habitual generosity? The Macedonian churches, despite their extreme poverty, demonstrated a surprising psychological phenomenon that modern neuroscience has only recently begun to explain. A transformation where giving becomes not merely an occasional choice but a fundamental orientation toward others. This summer season of generosity represents the critical transition when initial acts develop into sustainable patterns. Just as perennial plants establish deep root systems before flowering, communities experiencing transformation must cultivate durable networks of mutual care. Moving from spring's tentative beginnings, summer brings the deepening of roots that anchor generosity in community life. This cultivation requires intentional commitment to nurturing relationships through consistent practices that transcend momentary emotional impulses. Sustained generosity faces a significant challenge, persisting in kindness when results remain invisible or reciprocity appears absent. Jesus articulates this revolutionary ethic in Luke 6 verse 35, teaching us to love your enemies and do good and lend, expecting nothing in return. This establishes generosity as a reflection of divine character rather than a strategy for personal gain. Transformative generosity transcends transactional frameworks, requiring faith that apparently unrewarded kindness contributes to community flourishing. Neurological research affirms biblical wisdom. Consistent acts of kindness strengthen neural pathways associated with positive emotions, creating a biological foundation for ongoing generosity. Regular giving gradually rewires neural connections, establishing default responses of compassion that become increasingly automatic. This neuroplasticity explains why communities practicing consistent generosity find it progressively easier to maintain these patterns, as collective behavior begins to align with transformed neural architecture. Generosity networks illuminate how community transformation accelerates once kindness reaches critical mass. Acts of compassion create expanding ripples throughout social systems, as recipients become givers to others. These interconnections form relational infrastructure, enabling resources to flow organically to areas of greatest need without centralized coordination. Like an ecosystem where nutrients cycle through interdependent organisms, these networks create sustainable patterns of giving and receiving. Beyond practical benefits, sustained generosity cultivates the psychological conditions necessary for authentic community. Trust emerges when members experience reliable support during vulnerable periods, creating psychological safety. The confidence that revealing genuine needs will result in care rather than judgment. As vulnerability becomes normalized, community members develop deeper connections characterized by mutual understanding, further reinforcing their commitment to collective well-being. The agricultural metaphor in 2 Corinthians 9 verses 6-8 perfectly captures this principle. Whoever sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. Generosity operates not as a single transaction but as an investment pattern yielding returns proportional to consistent input. Communities practicing this principle discover that generosity generates resources rather than depleting them, as mutual care creates efficiencies impossible within individualistic frameworks. Jesus emphasizes another dimension of sustained generosity in Matthew 6 verses 1-4. The importance of giving in secret rather than for recognition. This preserves the integrity of the generosity ecosystem by ensuring that kindness emerges from authentic care rather than status seeking. Communities implementing this principle develop cultures where generosity becomes normalized, allowing compassion to flow naturally through ordinary interactions. The summer growth phase thus represents the critical period when inspirations mature into durable systems of mutual care, creating self-perpetuating ecosystems where generosity multiplies generosity, nurturing collective flourishing through interconnected relationships. Autumn's abundant harvest. The spiritual economics of kindness. As summer's growth matures into autumn's harvest, the spiritual economics of God's kingdom reveals its most profound paradox. What happens when a young boy's modest lunch of 5 loaves and 2 fish becomes a feast for thousands? And what does this ancient miracle reveal about an invisible economy where the smallest offerings yield the most extraordinary returns? In God's economy, the metrics of abundance operate according to principles that fundamentally contradict our conventional understanding of wealth accumulation and resource distribution. The feeding of the 5,000 recorded in John's Gospel perfectly illustrates this spiritual principle of divine multiplication. When faced with hungry multitudes, the disciples calculated insufficiency according to material economics. Yet this child's simple meal became supernatural abundance when placed in divine hands. This miracle illuminates the essence of God's economic system. Value multiplies through humble offering rather than accumulation. The boy's willingness to surrender his entire lunch created the conditions for extraordinary provision that transcends mathematical explanation. This divine paradox finds powerful expression in Proverbs 11 verses 24 to 25. One gives freely, yet grows all the richer, another withholds what he should give, and only suffers want. While conventional economics suggests that giving depletes resources and withholding preserves them, God's economy inverts this equation entirely. Those who cling tightly to their resources experience a form of spiritual poverty, while those who release their possessions with open hands participate in a mysterious multiplication that sustains both giver and receiver. The spiritual harvest manifests wealth that transcends financial metrics. God's economic system generates forms of capital no balance sheet can capture, the wealth of belonging when individuals feel truly seen, the richness of purpose that flows from participating in others' flourishing, the abundance of trust developed in vulnerable communities, and the prosperity of joy accompanying authentic connection. These spiritual assets appreciate with use, circulating within communities, they multiply rather than diminish. Theological understanding deepens when we recognize how everyday generosity participates in God's redemptive mission. Proverbs 19 verse 17 reveals this profound transaction. Whoever is generous to the poor lends to the Lord, and he will repay him for his deed. Our seemingly small gestures of care constitute investments in the divine economy, vertical partnerships with divine purpose. When we extend generosity, even in seemingly insignificant ways, we participate in God's ongoing work of restoration and healing. Communities embracing this harvest mentality develop remarkable resilience against cultural forces promoting isolation and materialism. They recognize that true security emerges from networks of mutual care rather than individual stockpiling. This explains how the early church, despite lacking substantial material resources, developed resistance to the exploitative economics of imperial Rome through their alternative economy of shared resources and mutual care. The Macedonian churches exemplified this principle. Despite experiencing extreme poverty, these communities overflowed with generosity, demonstrating that authentic abundance emerges from the quality of relationships rather than quantity of possessions. Their counterintuitive response to hardship, giving beyond their means, reveals how divine economics operates through supernatural provision that defies conventional logic. The sowing and reaping principle in 2 Corinthians 9 verses 6 to 8 provides the framework for understanding this divine economic system. Whoever sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and whoever sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. This agricultural metaphor reveals generosity as an investment with proportional returns, spiritual abundance that transcends financial measurement, yielding a harvest beyond calculation. The perennial garden, sustaining cycles of kindness and renewal. The divine harvest cycle extends beyond seasonal interventions, inviting us to contemplate what happens when generosity becomes the perennial rhythm of an entire community's existence. Unlike annual crops that require replanting each season, the most resilient faith communities cultivate kindness that returns year after year, withstanding even the harshest periods of collective hardship. The wisdom of Ecclesiastes reminds us that life moves in cycles, A time to plant and a time to uproot, a time to tear down and a time to build, a time to weep and a time to laugh. This cyclical framework illuminates how generosity functions within sustainable communities. These communities recognize that each member experiences seasons of abundance for generous giving and seasons of need for gracious receiving. This reciprocal understanding dissolves the artificial distinction between givers and receivers, acknowledging that all participants occupy both roles throughout their journey. Communities face the profound challenge of sustaining this generative cycle through transitions and difficulties. Economic downturns, internal conflicts, and leadership changes test a community's commitment to kindness most severely. Historical religious communities that have flourished for generations demonstrate a crucial adaptation. They develop generosity literacy, a collective wisdom to discern appropriate responses to varied needs across changing circumstances. Communities with generosity literacy recognize that different seasons require distinct expressions of kindness. During material scarcity, they emphasize resource sharing while offering emotional and spiritual support. In prosperity, they establish structures protecting vulnerable members through future downturns. This adaptive capacity ensures kindness remains responsive rather than rigid, addressing authentic needs beyond mere obligation. How might our communities cultivate this perennial kindness that withstands the harshest seasons of collective experience? Kindness stewardship provides another essential dimension for communities seeking multigenerational impact. Just as agricultural communities carefully preserve their best seeds, mature faith communities intentionally transmit generosity practices to younger generations through instruction and modeling. They create narratives, rituals, and organizational structures that embed generosity into the community's identity, making it resistant to individualistic values that threaten communal cohesion. The remarkable sustainability of communities that institutionalize kindness while preserving its relational essence achieves a delicate balance. The practice described in Matthew 6 verses 1-4, giving in secret, maintains recipient dignity while avoiding corruption through public recognition. When establishing formal systems for addressing needs, communities must protect the sacred, personal encounters that give kindness its transformative power, requiring regular communal discernment. The resilience of these generosity-centered communities becomes evident in historical challenges. Anabaptist communities have maintained mutual aid through centuries of persecution. Orthodox parishes have preserved almsgiving despite political revolutions. When kindness becomes a fundamental expression of communal identity, it develops remarkable capacity to transcend catastrophic disruptions. The divine economics revealed in these perennial communities transcends conventional wealth understanding. While financial systems deteriorate during stress, properly cultivated generosity intensifies during hardship. Acts 20 verse 35 captures this principle. It is more blessed to give than to receive, a truth most evident when resources seem most limited. Communities grounded in this principle discover their spiritual wealth appreciates precisely when material prosperity declines, creating stability that purely economic systems cannot achieve. As we conclude our journey through the Garden of Generosity, we witness a profound truth. God's economy measures wealth not through accumulation but through cultivation. John 3 verse 16 reminds us of this divine example, God's ultimate act of giving His Son. The reciprocal principle from Proverbs 11 verse 25 reveals that one who waters will himself be watered. As Master Gardener, God establishes the sowing and reaping principle that ensures our acts of kindness yield a harvest in due season. Consider one seed of kindness you might plant this week. Whether offering a listening ear, sharing resources, or extending forgiveness, your act becomes an encounter with Christ Himself. As you did it to one of the least of these, you did it to me. Each seed planted today blooms in God's kingdom, where kindness reveals itself as the true measure of wealth.